The rich, sprawling mansions of Beverly Hills are home to some of the most luxurious estates in the world. But nestled away on a quiet, unassuming street sits one house that has remained largely untouched by time. This mansion, with its peeling white paint and ivy-clad exterior, stands as a relic of an era long gone. It is called the Elizabeth Montgomery House, named after its last known resident, a woman whose life and death remained shrouded in mystery. The house had been vacant for years, with no one daring to buy it despite its prime location. Rumors circulated about strange happenings, whispers of voices echoing from the empty halls, and chilling lights that flickered in the dead of night. But it wasn't until the Mitchell family moved in that the truth behind the haunting began to surface. Catherine Mitchell, a successful real estate agent, and her husband Thomas, a rising tech entrepreneur, had been looking for the perfect house. When they saw the Elizabeth Montgomery House, with its classic architecture and enormous lot, they knew it was the one. The price was shockingly low, too good to pass up, even considering the strange rumors. First, it was a dream come true. But things took a darker turn almost immediately. It started with little things. Strange noises in the walls, scratching sounds that Catherine thought were simply the house settling. She dismissed them, of course. After all, old houses make noise. But then it got worse. Thomas had been in the study, unpacking boxes of tech equipment, when he heard something. Someone moving behind him. Soft shuffle of footsteps. But when he turned around, there was no one there. He assumed it was his imagination playing tricks on him and brushed it off. Then came the dreams. Catherine, who had never been particularly sensitive to the supernatural, began having vivid dreams of a woman. This woman was tall, with a pale face and dark, hollow eyes that seemed to follow Catherine wherever she went in her dream. She always stood in the corner of a room, watching Catherine with an expression of sorrow mixed with a strange, eerie intensity. No matter where Catherine went, the woman remained silent and unblinking. She mentioned these dreams to Thomas, who had been sleeping soundly, untroubled by any disturbances. He dismissed her concerns, reassuring her that it was likely stress from the move. But Catherine couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. One evening after dinner, Catherine decided to explore the attic. The space was vast and filled with dusty old furniture draped in white sheets, as if abandoned for decades. As she moved deeper into the attic, she stumbled upon an old portrait, a painting of a woman dressed in an elegant gown, her gaze directed downward with a look of quiet despair. Catherine froze. The woman in the painting looked exactly like the one from her dreams. Her heart raced. She had to know more. The next day, Catherine visited the local library in search of any information on Elizabeth Montgomery. She soon discovered that Elizabeth had been the original owner of the house, living there alone for years. She was a reclusive socialite known for her beauty and charm, but whispers of a tragic love story surrounded her name. Elizabeth had been deeply in love with a man named Victor, a wealthy businessman who had promised to marry her. However, on the eve of their wedding, Victor mysteriously disappeared, leaving Elizabeth devastated. Rumors began to circulate that Elizabeth had gone mad with grief. She locked herself in the house for years, rarely seen by anyone. Neighbors claimed to have heard her crying at night, and some said she would wander the halls, calling out Victor's name. Then one night she was found dead in the study, a single candle burning beside her, and the scent of roses in the air. No one knew what truly happened to Elizabeth Montgomery, but some believed she had died of a broken heart. Catherine returned to the house, disturbed by the discovery. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, she wandered into the study, where Elizabeth had died. The room was cold, unnervingly so, as if the walls themselves were holding onto some long-forgotten sorrow. And then, out of the corner of her eye, Catherine saw it, an ethereal figure standing by the window. It was Elizabeth Montgomery, as she had appeared in Catherine's dreams, her pale face staring back at her with those same hollow eyes. "Why are you here?" Catherine whispered, her voice trembling. The figure did not respond. Instead, Elizabeth slowly lifted her hand, pointing towards the door. It was a gesture that was both pleading and warning. Catherine felt a chill in her bones. She backed away, stumbling over her own feet, and as she did, she heard the faintest whisper. "Leave." The words echoed in the room, low and guttural. Catherine bolted from the study, her heart hammering in her chest. When she told Thomas about what she had seen, he was skeptical, chalking it up to stress. But Catherine knew that what she had witnessed was real. The house wasn't just old, it was haunted. And Elizabeth Montgomery wasn't the only spirit that lingered within those walls. That night, Catherine could hardly sleep. Her mind raced with thoughts of the woman in the attic, the portrait, the whispers. She decided to delve deeper, to find out if there were more to Elizabeth's story than the rumors told. But the more she uncovered, the more disturbing the truth became. In the months following Victor's disappearance, Elizabeth had become consumed by grief, her obsession with him growing stronger and more dangerous. There were accounts from neighbors describing strange lights flickering inside the house, and one even claimed to have seen Elizabeth standing on the balcony at midnight, her eyes glowing unnaturally. But no one had ever proven anything. Elizabeth had vanished, and the world moved on, leaving behind only whispers and legends. As Catherine sat in the library one evening, sifting through old records, she discovered something chilling. There was a final letter, one written by Elizabeth Montgomery herself. The letter was addressed to Victor, but it was not the romantic farewell one might expect. It was a plea, a desperate, haunting confession. "Victor, I have found a way. I will bring you back, no matter the cost. I will not live in this world without you." Catherine felt a cold shiver crawl up her spine. Elizabeth hadn't just mourned Victor. She had sought to bring him back. And in doing so, she had crossed into something far darker than Catherine could have ever imagined. It was then that Catherine realized Elizabeth's haunting was not merely a tragic love story. It was a warning. Catherine couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her, something malevolent lurking just out of sight. The house had always felt oppressive, but now it felt as if the very walls were closing in on her. Every creak of the floorboards seemed louder, every gust of wind more forceful. The temperature in the rooms would drop without explanation, and sometimes, Catherine swore she could hear faint whispers that were barely audible, yet unmistakably there. It had been a week since the letter, and Catherine couldn't stop thinking about what she had uncovered. The realization that Elizabeth Montgomery had tried to bring her lost love back from the dead haunted her thoughts, twisting them into dark corners. She wasn't sure what kind of ritual Elizabeth had tried to perform, but the more Catherine thought about it, the more she began to understand that it had something to do with the house itself. The house wasn't just a place where Elizabeth had lived. It was a vessel, a conduit for something beyond the realm of the living. Catherine shared her findings with Thomas, but he, ever the skeptic, still insisted that it was nothing more than superstition. He was busy with work, and the thought of supernatural forces hadn't even crossed his mind. To him, the idea of a tragic love story was just that, tragic. But to Catherine, it was becoming a terrifying reality. She needed to understand what had truly happened in the house, what Elizabeth had done, and what lingering forces were now playing with their lives. One evening, Catherine decided to explore further. She had spent days going through the attic and library, but there were still unanswered questions. What had Elizabeth truly done to bring Victor back? What had she become? And why, after all these years, was the house still acting as a magnet for these restless spirits? The answer came when she stumbled upon an old leather-bound book, hidden beneath the floorboards of the attic. It was dust-covered, old enough to have been forgotten by time, but the feeling it gave off was anything but. The moment Catherine opened it, she felt an intense cold rush over her, as if the house itself had taken a sharp breath. The pages were written in a mix of elegant script and dark, ancient symbols that Catherine could barely recognize. She felt a sense of dread wash over her as she read the introduction. To awaken what sleeps is to invite the shadows. To bring forth a soul that is lost is to open a door to the beyond. The book detailed various rituals for communing with the dead, but the deeper Catherine delved, the darker the spells became. Elizabeth had used this very book, this forbidden text, to attempt the impossible, to bring Victor back from the dead. And it had worked. For a time. But there was a price. In the book's last cryptic entry, it was written that Elizabeth had failed to complete the ritual, leaving her love trapped between worlds. But instead of being free, Victor's soul became bound to the house, eternally tethered to the space where Elizabeth had called him back. The ritual had not only broken the boundaries between the living and the dead, it had torn a hole into a realm of darkness, a place where the dead could never rest. Catherine felt her stomach drop. If the book was to be believed, Elizabeth Montgomery hadn't just conjured Victor's spirit, she had unleashed something far worse. Something ancient and malevolent. The ground beneath Catherine's feet seemed to shift. She looked up, hearing a soft, unmistakable sound, the scraping of nails on wood. She wasn't alone. As she turned to look, a gust of wind blew through the room, scattering the pages of the book. There, standing in the doorway, was the figure of a man. He was tall, gaunt, with hollow eyes that reflected a terrifying sadness. His hair was dark, matted, his clothes torn and stained, but it was the face that struck her the most, twisted in agony. It was Victor. He didn't speak, but his eyes, the depths of them, seemed to scream. His gaze burned into Catherine as if he were trying to communicate something. A warning, perhaps. Catherine stepped back, her breath caught in her throat, as she tried to steady herself. She had seen Elizabeth, but this was different. This was not a dream. The figure of Victor didn't move, yet the air grew thick with an unbearable sense of dread. Then, without warning, he vanished into the shadows, leaving only the echo of his presence lingering in the room. Catherine could barely breathe. Her mind raced. The truth was worse than she had imagined. The house was cursed, and Elizabeth Montgomery had damned herself and the ones she loved by seeking to bring back the dead. But there was something worse than that. Victor's spirit, trapped and tormented, was still bound to the house. And now, it wasn't just his spirit that lingered. There was something else. Catherine rushed downstairs to find Thomas. She had to tell him what she had seen, what she had discovered. But when she reached the living room, her blood ran cold. Thomas was standing in front of the large mirror on the wall, staring at his own reflection. He was pale, his expression frozen in a way that was almost unnatural. "Thomas," Catherine called, her voice barely a whisper. Thomas didn't respond. His eyes were wide, fixed on his reflection, but there was something wrong with the way he looked, something off. His face was gaunt, his features twisted in a way that made him appear sickly, as if his very soul had begun to wither away. Catherine stepped closer, her heart pounding in her chest. She reached out to touch him, but as her hand brushed his shoulder, a cold chill ran through her fingers, as if she had touched ice. Suddenly Thomas spoke, but it wasn't his voice. "Leave. You should never have come here." The voice that came from his lips was deep and guttural, unlike anything Catherine had ever heard before. It was as though Victor, Elizabeth's lost love, had taken possession of Thomas. He turned to face her, and for a split second, Catherine saw Victor's eyes in Thomas's face, those hollow, sorrowful eyes now filled with malice. Before she could react, Thomas stumbled backward, his hands trembling, as if trying to free himself from an unseen force. His breath became shallow, ragged. "Catherine." "Help me," he gasped. The room darkened as the air grew thick with the same oppressive force Catherine had felt earlier. The walls seemed to close in, and from the corners of the room, the faint whispers began again. Voices, soft and faint, but unmistakable. They were all around her, filling her mind with terror. "It's too late," the voice of Victor echoed in her mind. With a final, strained cry, Thomas collapsed to the floor, writhing in agony. Catherine fell to her knees beside him, her heart breaking at the sight of her husband suffering. But there was nothing she could do. Nothing anyone could do. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything went silent. Thomas lay still on the floor, unconscious but alive. The room was deathly quiet. Catherine, shaken and terrified, realized the horrifying truth. Victor wasn't the only spirit trapped in the house. There was something darker, something older that had been waiting. And now it had claimed Thomas. She had to leave. They both had to leave. But how could they escape when the house itself was alive with restless spirits? And whatever had bound Victor to this place had now found a new host. The silence that followed Thomas's collapse was suffocating. Catherine knelt beside him, her hands trembling as she checked his pulse. He was breathing, but his body felt cold, unnaturally so. His skin was pale, his eyes shut tightly, and his face contorted in a way that seemed as if he were locked in a nightmarish battle. A low moan escaped his lips, but there was no recognition in his gaze when his eyes fluttered open. "Catherine." His voice was weak, distant. "Thomas." You're okay, she whispered, brushing his hair back from his forehead, though she could feel the tension in her chest grow tighter. The Thomas she knew was still inside, but something else was now holding him hostage. "I don't feel right," he muttered, his voice strained. Catherine's heart broke. It wasn't just the house. She knew it. This place, this cursed house, was pulling Thomas deeper into its grasp, just as it had done to Elizabeth Montgomery. If they didn't leave, if they didn't break free, it would claim him. But how? Catherine helped Thomas to his feet, though he stumbled, disoriented, and clung to her for support. They made their way out of the living room and toward the front door, but the house seemed to have other plans. As they crossed the hallway, Catherine's skin prickled, and the air grew thick and heavy, oppressive. She heard it again, the whispers. They were everywhere, filling her mind with incoherent murmurs, a cacophony of voices. "Catherine," Thomas's voice was a strained whisper, barely audible over the growing noise. His eyes shifted nervously as though he were listening to something she couldn't hear. "Catherine, do you hear that?" I don't hear anything." She looked at him, trying to remain calm, but the sense of impending doom was overwhelming. The house was alive with something malevolent, something ancient that had never truly let go of its past. Thomas's gaze flickered. "It's here," he said, his voice flat and hollow. "It's all around us." She grabbed his hand, her pulse quickening, and pulled him toward the front door. But as she reached for the doorknob, a loud bang echoed from upstairs. It was followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming down the stairs. Catherine froze. "Do you hear that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Thomas nodded slowly, his face pale. "It's coming for us," he said, his tone barely a whisper, as if he had already resigned himself to the truth. From the shadows at the top of the stairs, a figure emerged, a tall, slender shape that seemed to drift rather than walk. It was Elizabeth Montgomery, but her appearance was far from the graceful, elegant woman in the portraits. Her once beautiful face was gaunt, her eyes hollow and sunken, as if she hadn't seen the light of day for decades. Her lips were twisted into a cruel, unnatural smile. Catherine's heart pounded in her chest as Elizabeth's cold eyes locked onto her. "You shouldn't have come here." Elizabeth's voice was a soft, chilling whisper that seemed to reverberate through Catherine's bones. "You shouldn't have disturbed me." Catherine pulled Thomas closer, her breath quickening. "Whoa, this is my house. I won't let you have him." The words came out louder than she expected, driven by a surge of desperate courage. Elizabeth's smile faltered, and for a moment, her form flickered. Then, her face twisted in anger, and she took a step forward, her movements jerky and unnatural. The air around them grew colder still, as if the very walls of the house were closing in. "You think you can leave?" Elizabeth's voice became a low growl. "Victor and I were bound together by fate. Your husband is a part of this now. You cannot escape." Catherine could feel her pulse pounding in her ears, the walls shaking as if the house were alive, breathing. She gripped Thomas tighter, her fingers numb. Her mind raced. The only thing that had kept her from breaking down into panic was the knowledge that this was not just a tragedy. It was a curse. A curse born of grief and desperation, of forbidden rituals that had torn the fabric between the living and the dead. "We won't let you have him," Catherine shouted, her voice breaking. Elizabeth's laughter was like the sound of cracking glass, sharp and unsettling. "You don't understand. He is already mine. Just as I was Victor's, and just as the house was mine." You cannot take him away from me. Catherine's mind raced. She had seen something in the book, a mention of a ritual that could sever the bond between the living and the dead, a way to break the curse. But it was dangerous, a last-ditch attempt, and it had a terrible price. But what choice did she have? If they stayed, they would both be consumed by the house. She turned to Thomas, her voice trembling but determined. Thomas, listen to me. You need to fight it. You need to fight her. Thomas blinked. His eyes glazed over. I can't, his voice wavered, strained, as though he were speaking through a fog. She's here, she's always been here. But Catherine refused to give up. She pulled him toward the hallway and toward the basement stairs. Come on, we need to get to the basement, she urged, her words desperate. Thomas hesitated, but Catherine's grip on his hand tightened. You're stronger than this. I know you are. She led him down the stairs into the basement, the air growing colder the deeper they went. The darkness seemed to press in on them, and for a moment, Catherine felt as if the walls themselves were alive, shifting, watching. But in the basement, she knew she would find the key. The book had mentioned a place, the heart of the house where the ritual could be undone. As they reached the farthest corner of the basement, Catherine found what she was looking for, an old stone altar, overgrown with vines and dust. In its center lay a black, intricately carved box, the same one from the old book. She had seen it. Thomas was still by her side, though his breathing was shallow, strained, as if he were losing control of himself. Elizabeth's influence had already taken root, but Catherine wasn't going to let her win. She knelt beside the altar and began to open the box. Inside, there was an ornate dagger, its handle engraved with the same symbols from the book. The ritual was clear now, but using it would be dangerous. She had no idea what it would truly cost, or whether it would even work. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, echoing through the house, closing in on her. You can't escape, the voices taunted. You can't break us. Catherine's hands shook as she lifted the dagger, but as she held it up, she saw something in the shadows. Elizabeth standing in the doorway, watching her with those hollow eyes. The time for hesitation was over. Catherine whispered a prayer under her breath, then raised the dagger, her heart pounding in her chest. She had to sever the bond between the house and the spirits that haunted it. It was the only way. She could hear Thomas's labored breathing behind her, and she knew this would be their only chance. With one swift motion, Catherine plunged the dagger into the heart of the altar. The house seemed to shudder, the walls groaning in protest as the temperature dropped even further. The ground beneath her feet trembled, and the very air around them seemed to vibrate with an intense, otherworldly force. The whispers turned into shrill screams, louder and more anguished, as if every spirit trapped within the house was fighting to stay, to pull them back into the abyss. And then, just as suddenly, everything went silent. Catherine opened her eyes, gasping for breath, and looked around. The basement was still, eerily quiet. She could feel Thomas beside her, his hand still tightly gripped in hers, but his presence had changed. The coldness that had overtaken him was gone, replaced by warmth and the familiar feeling of his hand in hers. They had done it. But at what cost? The silence that followed the ritual was suffocating. Catherine's pulse raced as she slowly stood, her legs trembling beneath her. The basement, which had once felt like a suffocating prison, now seemed to exhale in relief, as though it had been released from a decades-old torment. The air was still cold, but it no longer felt oppressive. It felt empty. She glanced over at Thomas, his face still pale but no longer twisted in that haunted, vacant expression. He was blinking rapidly, as though trying to shake off the fog that had clouded his mind. His body trembled, and when their eyes met, he looked at her with a bewildered expression. Catherine! His voice was weak, yet it carried an unmistakable note of recognition. What happened? What did you do? Catherine swallowed hard, her throat dry, and a sense of relief washed over her. He was back. He was himself again. She had saved him. I don't know, she stammered, her heart racing as she helped him steady himself. But I think we're free now. The curse, the spirits, they should be gone. But as the words left her lips, a chill crawled up her spine. The basement, the house, everything felt eerily calm, too calm. She turned, glancing back at the altar. The dagger had already vanished, absorbed into the stone like it had never existed. The symbols on the altar had faded too, their once glowing edges now just worn, indistinct lines. It was as if the house, with all its twisted energy, was beginning to settle. But something still gnawed at her, a sensation, a presence in the air that refused to fade. "Catherine," Thomas's voice cut through the tension, bringing her focus back to him. "Something's wrong. I don't feel right." Catherine turned back to him, concern rising in her chest. "What do you mean?" Thomas rubbed his temples, his face creased with pain. "I don't know. It's like a shadow is following me. Something's still here." Her breath hitched. "Whoa, that can't be possible. I used the ritual. It's over." "Where?" Before she could finish her sentence, the walls of the basement creaked. The sound was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but then it grew louder, more violent. The temperature dropped again, and the once still air became charged with an electric unease. Catherine's heart hammered in her chest. Suddenly, the shadows in the basement seemed to stretch, twisting, flickering like a flame caught in the wind. Catherine could feel them, pressing in from all sides, thick and suffocating. "Thomas, we need to get out." Now, Catherine's voice cracked as panic set in. But Thomas remained frozen, his face slowly contorting into something unrecognizable. His eyes wide, pupils dilated, his breath coming in quick gasps. The presence that had once haunted him, that had taken over his body, was creeping back into him. "No," he gasped, shaking his head. "No, I can't stop it. It's inside me, Catherine. It's all inside me." Catherine's blood ran cold as she watched in horror. The shadows seemed to grow darker around Thomas, swirling like a storm, feeding off his fear. The house was rejecting the ritual. It hadn't been enough. She hadn't been strong enough to sever the ties completely. "No!" Catherine screamed, rushing forward to grab him. "Don't let it take you again, Thomas." But it was too late. Thomas's body buckled, as if some invisible force were crushing him from within. His eyes rolled back into his head, his mouth opening in a silent scream. The shadows surged around him, swallowing him whole, and for a moment, Catherine was left standing in the oppressive darkness, alone in the basement with nothing but the distant sound of her own frantic heartbeat. Then, through the suffocating blackness, a figure emerged. It was Elizabeth. Her form flickered in and out of existence, an ethereal image born of the house itself. Her face was even more grotesque than before. Her skin stretched thin, her eyes burning with hatred. She stepped closer, gliding through the shadows with an unnatural grace, her presence overwhelming, as if the very air around her became tainted with the weight of her torment. "You think you've freed him?" Elizabeth's voice echoed in the darkness, sharp and cruel. "You think you've freed yourselves? You're fools." Catherine staggered backward, fear seizing her chest as Elizabeth's cold gaze pinned her in place. "Your ritual wasn't enough, Catherine. You cannot escape what has been bound to this house. We are the house. And you," Elizabeth's voice grew dark, cold, like 1,000 voices whispering in unison. "You are our final sacrifice." "No," Catherine whispered, shaking her head in disbelief. "No, it can't be. The book," it said. "The book lies," Elizabeth interjected sharply, her smile twisted. "You think you can just erase what was done? The ritual you performed only delayed the inevitable. You think you can leave with him, but you've bound yourselves to the house as much as I am bound to it. You and your husband are forever entwined with the souls that never found peace. You're ours." Catherine's chest tightened with panic. She looked back at Thomas, who was still writhing on the floor, his body twitching uncontrollably, his mouth opening and closing in silent screams. Something was happening to him, something far worse than possession. He was becoming part of the house, part of the curse. "No, I won't let you," Catherine cried out, reaching for anything, any way to stop this nightmare. But Elizabeth's laughter echoed through the basement like 1,000 broken promises, drowning out her thoughts. You're already too late. There's no escape. You're as much a part of this house as I am. Suddenly, Catherine heard it, the faintest whisper coming from deep within the house. A voice. No voices calling out to her. Help me, help us. Her heart clenched in her chest. The spirits. Elizabeth was right. They were trapped here, bound to the house forever. And so were she and Thomas. The house wasn't just a home. It was a prison for the souls who had died here, forever waiting for the next to join them. And now they had. A desperate thought came to her mind. The house, it was alive, yes, but it was built on pain. Pain and love. A love that had never been allowed to rest. Elizabeth had sought to bring Victor back, but she had only opened a door. And now, the house wanted a new soul to replace the one that had been lost. A sharp, desperate clarity flooded Catherine's mind. She could feel it, the presence that had been lingering, waiting for her to realize. She couldn't save Thomas. She couldn't save herself. But she could finish what Elizabeth had started. She could release them all. But it would come at a price. And there was no turning back. Catherine's heart hammered in her chest, a frantic pulse against the suffocating silence that had once again descended upon the basement. The shadows, those thick, writhing things that had clung to every corner of the house, were now pressing in on her, urging her toward a fate she could not avoid. The oppressive weight of Elizabeth's presence loomed over her like a dark cloud, her form flickering with unholy energy. The air was thick with despair, heavy with the cries of trapped spirits. Elizabeth's voice, though low, echoed like 1,000 fractured whispers, each one biting at Catherine's resolve. You can't escape, Catherine, Elizabeth said, her words slithering through the room like poison. The house will claim you, and your husband will remain ours. Forever. Catherine's gaze flickered to Thomas, his body convulsing on the floor, racked with pain. His eyes were wide and unseeing, his mouth open in a soundless scream. The shadows, like living tendrils, seemed to burrow beneath his skin, pulling him deeper into the house. He was no longer just a victim of the curse. He was becoming part of it. No, Catherine whispered, stepping toward him. Her voice cracked under the weight of her own fear, but she couldn't stop herself. She had to try. Please, Thomas, fight it. Fight her. We can still get out of here. Her voice faltered as she knelt beside him, her fingers trembling as they brushed against his skin. He was cold, so cold. His pulse was faint, barely there. But even as her hand rested on his shoulder, she could feel a deep, unnatural pull beneath the surface. The house was feeding on him, feeding on them both, and with each passing second, she could feel her own strength draining away. Elizabeth stepped forward, her eyes narrowing in cruel amusement. You are foolish to think you can change what's been set in motion. The house demands its tribute, and Thomas is mine, just as you will be. Catherine's blood ran cold. She had to make a choice. The realization hit her like a slap to the face. The curse that bound Elizabeth to the house wasn't merely a curse of revenge. It was one of possession. The souls of those who died here were locked in the house, their fates forever intertwined with its very foundation. They could never be freed unless the house was released from its twisted grip on the world. And to release it, Catherine understood now, she would have to give up everything. Her breath caught in her throat. She could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on her, but in that moment, it felt like she had no choice. To free Thomas, to free herself, to give peace to the souls that lingered here, she had to confront the house itself. Catherine stood up slowly, her eyes not leaving Thomas's tortured form. She turned to Elizabeth, her voice steady despite the fear choking her from within. I won't let you have him, she said, her voice quiet but full of unwavering determination. You've already taken so much. But I won't let you take him too. If this house is to be destroyed, I will be the one to do it. Elizabeth's laughter rang out, sharp and chilling. You think you have the power to destroy me? To destroy the house, she asked, amusement clear in her voice. You have no idea what you're dealing with, Catherine. You have no idea what you are up against. Catherine reached into the pocket of her coat, pulling out the torn page from the book she had found earlier. The page was stained and worn, the ink faded in some places, but the symbols, the ritual that she had performed earlier, remained clear. She could feel the energy pulsing from it, as if it were calling to her, urging her to finish what had been started. Elizabeth's eyes narrowed, her smile faltering. "You cannot destroy me," she hissed, her voice suddenly sharp with rage. "I am the house. I am its heartbeat." Catherine took a deep breath. The words she spoke next were not just for Elizabeth. They were for herself, for Thomas, for all of the souls trapped here. She had to believe this would work. "I can't destroy you," she said slowly, her voice gaining strength. "But I can take away your power." Elizabeth's eyes flickered with a strange, knowing look. "What are you talking about?" Catherine held the page aloft, her fingers trembling as she recited the final incantation from the book. Her voice rang through the basement, reverberating off the walls, and with each word, the house seemed to tremble in response. The temperature dropped even further, and the shadows seemed to writhe more violently, as if they were alive and resisting. The darkness thickened, surrounding her and Thomas. But Catherine held her ground. "I sever the ties that bind you," she whispered, her words almost drowned out by the low, rumbling growl of the house. "I release the souls imprisoned here. I break your hold over us." Elizabeth's face twisted into a mask of fury, her hands raised as if to strike. "You will fail," she shrieked. "This house is my home. I will never leave. You will never leave." But Catherine's words continued, growing louder with each passing second. As she spoke, she could feel the house's power beginning to crack. The walls seemed to pulse with each syllable, the very ground beneath her feet shaking. The shadows that had once consumed everything were now fading, being swallowed by the light of the incantation. And then, with a deafening crash, the house itself seemed to break apart. Elizabeth's form flickered one last time. Her face contorted in a final, agonized scream as the energy of the house began to unravel. The shadows, the darkness that had held them all captive for so long, began to evaporate, dissipating into nothingness. Catherine collapsed to her knees, exhausted, the page still gripped tightly in her hand. The house groaned, its foundation crumbling around them. But the cold, suffocating weight of its presence had lifted. The curse was broken. "Catherine." Thomas's voice was weak, but it was real. He was back. His warmth returned to her side, and she turned to see him. His eyes filled with confusion, but also with clarity. He was himself again, the fog lifted from his mind. "We're free," Catherine whispered, her voice a raw mixture of relief and disbelief. "We're free." Thomas pulled her into an embrace, and for the first time since entering the house, Catherine felt safe. The nightmare was over. But as they stood there, holding each other, Catherine glanced around the basement, now devoid of the oppressive shadows. The house was no longer alive. The energy that had once powered its haunting grip had vanished. It was over. But as they made their way to the stairs, Catherine couldn't shake the feeling that the house would never truly release its hold on the land. What had once been a place of luxury and beauty had become a vessel of torment. And though they had broken the curse, Catherine knew the haunting of Elizabeth Montgomery House would linger, whispering through the winds of Beverly Hills, a warning for anyone who dared enter its gates.